In this video, we're going to take a look at how to read different reproductive cycles and life cycles for a variety of different organisms. So typically when students stare at these pictures, they get scared, confused, and they don't know what's going on. So I'm going to teach you how to read these pictures as opposed to having to memorize these pictures. And these will apply to essentially all the kingdoms and domains that we're studying. While there are some that I will expect you to memorize, the majority of the big ones like this you don't really have to memorize, but more so you'll have to explain using the keywords that are provided within the picture. So a life cycle is essentially events that happen within an organism's life that include growth and reproduction, and it's a cycle, so it happens over and over and over again. So here we can see a reproductive cycle for an organism from the fungus kingdom. And even if you haven't seen or studied this cycle before, if you have a good enough picture, you can basically rummage your way through it. You can figure out what's going on by taking a look at the keywords that are provided, the animations, the pictures, the coloration, the legends as well. And you can even give yourself, come up with definitions for words you've never seen before. So the idea is that by the end of this presentation, you'll be able to take a look at a scary diagram like this and make sense of it even though you have never seen it before. So we'll start with a very simple one. It's something that we've seen before and that you have a fairly good understanding of because it's the life cycle for humans. So there are some things that you will have to memorize and that you will have to know how to pay attention to. The first thing I want you to pay attention to in these life cycle diagrams, these generation diagrams, is the color coding and to distinguish different phases in the life cycle. So you might see a haploid stage represented by, in this case, a blue color, and a red or pink colored represents the diploid stage, and haploids represented by the letter N, diploids represented by the letter 2N. And then you'll also have these little boxes that show an event, and typically you could figure out what that event does by looking at the ploidy and comparing the ploidy before and after an event. So for example, if we look at the multicellular diploid adults over here, their 2N is equal to 46. After meiosis, look at the ploidy, you end up with N, haploid, N is equal to 23. So meiosis, if I didn't give you this haploid number here, you should have been able to figure it out based on the fact that meiosis is a process that halves the ploidy. If we go look over here at fertilization, the gamete has a ploidy of N, and the sperm has a ploidy of N, so egg and sperm have ploidy of N. After fertilization, look at the ploidy, it's now a diploid zygote. So fertilization doubles the ploidy. If you had N and N, now it's 2N. Now, although not drawn here, you could have probably put another box that says mitosis. And the way I would have known that this box is mitosis here is because if you compare the diploid processes, the diploid number before and after, you have 2N is equal to 46. Over here after, you have 2N is equal to 46. So the ploidy does not change if mitosis is the process that's involved. So those are some key things you should memorize, but other than that, it's pretty straightforward to explain it based on the picture that's provided. The other reason I knew that this was mitosis operating is because typically when you see a unicellular organism become multicellular, it's meiosis that's involved, for the most part. So this is the key life cycle that you should know inside and out. You need to memorize this. However, others will have to decipher as we're given a picture. So we'll do some examples on the next few slides. Let's take a look at some examples over here. These are the terms that I just discussed. Meiosis cuts the ploidy in half, mitosis preserves the ploidy, and fertilization doubles the ploidy. And so you should be able to figure out where those different terms go in these different life cycles. So here we have a life cycle for animals, similar to the ones we saw in humans. Over here we have some information given to us, and you should be able to fill in these diagrams based on what you see occurring in the diagram based on the keywords. So here we have some gametes that are N. Here we see fertilization. So this circle here, I know it's probably another N because fertilization is usually when two gametes fuse. And then after fertilization, I know that I should have 2N, a zygote with 2N. Now, if I didn't give you this keyword, I would have known this is mitosis because my zygote is becoming a multicellular organism. And I know this is mitosis, so that means that my multicellular organism must have a preserved ploidy of 2n. Now take a look at what's happening here. We go from 2n to n all of a sudden. So you would know that the process that has a ploidy is meiosis, and you can write that in to this box over here, meiosis. You can go and take a look at this reproductive cycle over here. It's called alternation of generations for plants and some algae. So over here we have, let's go just find a spot where you can fill things out. So here we have a zygote that's 2n. It goes through mitosis and it makes a, it should preserve ploidy, so we have 2n over here, we know that. Now we go through meiosis, and meiosis halves the ploidy, so we should have n and n over here. And now we go through mitosis again to make a multicellular haploid individual. And so since we're going through mitosis, the ploidy will be maintained, not doubled, so it'll be n over here as well. That's the key feature of alternation of generation. The alternation of generation's sexual life cycle involves a diploid multicellular stage and a haploid multicellular stage. You'll notice for humans, for example, there's only one multicellular stage, and that's the diploid one. You'll notice in this situation over here for fungi and some protists, there is a multicellular stage, but that multicellular stage is only the haploid one. So alternation of generations is really, there's two multicellular stages involved, diploid and haploid. But let's take a look if we can get this box over here. Two gametes are combining, so we know that's the fertilization piece. And you can also come up with definitions. You can also explain this. You can look at this picture, and even if you haven't seen it before, you can come up with an explanation on the fly. So you can say you have a haploid spore, you can use that keyword, that goes through mitosis to produce a haploid multicellular organism that we call a gametophyte. The gametophyte, through mitosis again, will produce these gametes, and then the gametes will combine through fertilization to make a zygote. The zygote will go through mitosis and produce a diploid multicellular organism that's called a sporophyte. The sporophyte will then use meiosis to produce some spores, and then the cycle can happen over and over again. So even if you've never seen this before, you can use these keywords to explain what's going on. Let's go try to do the same thing for this one over here, the cycle for fungi and protists, for some protists. So if we look over here, we have a multicellular organism. It goes through mitosis to make its gametes. So unlike the case that we saw in humans, sometimes mitosis can make gametes. So we've seen that in this situation here and this situation here. So your first introduction to genetics was basically meiosis is for gametes, mitosis is not. But in other organisms, mitosis actually can make gametes. So now we know that. So let's go and take a look at what's happening. So gametes are made through mitosis, so the N is preserved. We see fertilization here. That means two gametes are going to fuse to make a diploid zygote. Using the process of meiosis, we're going to have some N occur over here, so some N organisms are made. And then over here, as we go from singular N or single-celled N to multicellular N, we're probably doing the process of mitosis. So again, using the information within the diagrams, you should be able to fill them out and give some general ideas or explanation of what's going on. So these are the three main types of sexual life cycles. These are the most common ones. This one here is the most common one you'll see in animals. You'll see alternation of generations in plants and algae, which is basically a type of protist. And then you'll see this mechanism over here in many fungi and some protists as well. Now we're going to see if we're right. Hopefully we are. Sometimes mistakes happen. And we're right. So you should be able to do a practice problem. You can try this one out here. Pause the video, try it out yourself. So here we're looking at an alternation of generations life cycle. No need to memorize. Let's take a look at what's happening. We're going to go and fill in the boxes as best we can. So we have some spores. I'm going to start with the spores. You just got to start somewhere. Start somewhere and see if you can figure things out in any direction. So spores make this thing called a gametophyte. Look at the N. It's N here and N here. So my best guess right now is that this is probably going to be mitosis because the ploidy was preserved. And I think that the spores are unicellular and the gametophyte is multicellular. So I know that that happened through mitosis. Now the gametophyte makes some gametes. There's still N here. There's still N. So I think this is the case of where the gametes are made by mitosis because the ploidy is preserved. So now I see the key word going over here, fertilization, where the sperm and the egg combine together to make a zygote. So this is 2N over here. And then through mitosis, that zygote, which was one cell, becomes multicellular. Becomes 2N multicellular. Let's take a look. 2N to go to N over here. So this sporophyte is going to make haploid individuals called spores, probably through the process of meiosis because we went from 2N to N. So the point is starting somewhere where you can see if you can get an answer, and slowly as you fill in more and more for these diagrams, you'll get better and better at understanding what's going on and how to complete these. So you can try out these problems here as well. Here I put some guiding questions for you to answer using the diagram that's provided. You should pause the video, try it yourself, and then come back and see if your answers are correct. So use the figure below or to the left to complete the questions below. So the terms for opposite mating types combining is. So let's go find wherever we can see opposite mating types. So I have mating type over here and mating type over here, and these two arrows seem to show them coming together. So I think this is the term that we're going to use, plasmogamy. Plasmogamy is the term for opposite mating types fusing or combining. Plasmogamy. The term for the fusion of nuclei to form a diploid organism is called. So let's go take a look. Usually when you're looking for a process name, you're looking at these boxes. I don't think it's meiosis. We know what meiosis is already, so we can kind of get that out of the way. Maybe it's plasmogamy. We already used it, but let's just take a look. I don't know if I see any nucleus fusing. Let's go over here. So if you take a look in this picture, you have these dikaryotic cells. And I'm guessing that dikaryotic probably means that each one of these parts has two nuclei. And then after this process, if you look at the cells, they each have one nucleus. It's purple as opposed to blue and red. So I'm pretty sure that based on this, we just saw fusion of nuclei. And the other thing I can look at also is to form a diploid organism. So if you look at the coloring, we have haploid in the blue, we have dikaryotic in this purple, and then diploid over here. And I'm guessing that dikaryotic, just based on this picture, assuming I've never seen it before, is you actually have two separate nuclei in the same organism. They just haven't fused yet to really become diploid. So I can look at the color coding too. I have dikaryotic for purple, and then it goes to red over here, and that's diploid. So I would say in this case that the process to fuse nuclei to make a diploid organism is karyogamy. The process that results in haploid organisms is called, well, let's take a look. We have a diploid organism over here, and then we have haploid over here, and it looks like to go from diploid to haploid, the process was meiosis. So you should be able to do problems like this, so you can try this out, pause the video, try it yourself, and then come back and see if you're on the right track. So spores are, so let's go see, spores are, let's go find spores. If we look over here, spores, they have the letter N, so you should know that means haploid, and are produced by the process of. So let's see when spores form. So here's spores. Directly before spores we see meiosis, so it looks like spores are produced by the process of meiosis. Zygotes. Let's go find zygotes, because now I would always go back and verify with your image here, just because sometimes a term might sound the same, or we might use the same term for different things. So you gotta be careful here. So zygote over here looks like, yes, it's diploid in this case, and it's produced by the process of, just directly before the zygote we see fertilization. You can write the whole thing out. A zygote becomes a feeding plasmodium through the process of, well, let's see. So here we have the zygote, here we have the feeding plasmodium. Now in this case, there's no key term between the zygote and the feeding plasmodium, but chances are you're going from one cell to many cells. So if you're going from one cell to many cells, and you also didn't change the ploidy because we still have the same color, it's still diploid, I would say that's mitosis. So you're thinking a bit here. You're using your knowledge and understanding of mitosis and meiosis to figure out which process that would be. And if I were to ask you and extend this even more, well, how do we go from the feeding plasmodium to a mature plasmodium? Now, this could be wrong, and your hypothesis could be wrong, but reasonably, if a student, for example, would have said that maybe apoptosis happens, maybe some cells die off and are thrown off from this structure to create this fruiting sort of structure over here, that would have been a reasonable assumption to make just looking at the picture. It might not be the right one, but it's reasonable. Or maybe some students might have said that there's a process called enucleation. You might have heard about that when red blood cells form, so enucleation. Perhaps that was a process, because you can see that nuclei are no longer present in these sections over here. So these are some reasonable hypotheses that you could have made in case they're missing, and then you could go and do some research to figure out what actually did happen. For the most part, though, I'm going to ask you questions such as this over here: fertilization, meiosis, mitosis, ploidy, and other things like we saw on the previous slide. Here's another set of practice problems you can do. So again, pause the video and then try it out yourself. List the names of the multicellular stages in this life cycle. We can fill in the blanks actually. The diploid multicellular stage is called so basically big circles like this with little lines in between, those are the multicellular stage. So the diploid one, I know this is the diploid one because it's 2N, is called the sporophyte. The haploid one is called the gametophyte. Haploid spores become gametophytes through the process of, so here's a haploid spore, it becomes a gametophyte through the process of mitosis. Sporophytes produce haploid spores through the process of, so here's a sporophyte. It produces haploid spores through the process of meiosis. A zygote becomes a sporophyte through the process of, let's take a look. Here we have a zygote, becomes a sporophyte through the process of mitosis. And so hopefully you were able to use this video to understand that these diagrams are not so scary after all. There are some you have to memorize, for example, the human life cycle. I would even try to memorize this one over here. This is the alternation of generations, because you will see it come up again when we get to the plants unit and the plants part of the diversity section, where you will have to memorize some of those. Here's another set of practice problems. You can try this out, pause the video, see if you're on the right track. So sporangia are, let's find sporangia. Here we have sporangia. We don't see a letter N yet, but we see it from the sporophyte here, but the sporangia is still in this red section, so I would say they're diploid. Through the process of blank, sporangia produce blank, which can develop into male and female blank. Okay, so let's take a look. So sporangia, through the process of, it looks like sporangia go in here, meiosis. Sporangia produce, what do they produce? It looks like they're producing zoospore. Zoospore. Which can develop into male and female gametophytes. Which are haploid. How do I know that? Take a look. N. Also look at the color coding. Haploid. The male gametophyte will release sperm, which it looks like fertilize the egg. Fertilize the egg of the female gametophyte in order to produce a diploid zygote. The zygote eventually develops into a sporophyte. Sporophyte. Oops. Right here you can see sporophyte. It's developing, and here's a sporophyte. Now the sporophyte contains, so here's a sporophyte, it contains sporangia, which is what we started off with at the beginning. So we went through a whole cycle, we explained what was happening in this image, just using the keywords and our knowledge of what's going on in this process. So here we can see an example of a alternation of generations. We can see a multicellular diploid stage and also a multicellular haploid stage. So we saw alternations of generations happening in this process over here. And what we just saw was actually the life cycle of the brown algae, which is a type of protist that goes through alternation of generation. And we just basically explained the whole process as we see here using the images.